Welcome back, everyone, for our next set of sessions here at the day one of our EV Infrastructure Summit 2020. I would now like to introduce our next panel session on the funding, incentives, and support for the EV market transition. Our moderator is Reza Shaybani, co-founder and CEO of the Electric Vehicle Network. Reza has been managing private and public technology-focused companies in the optical media manufacturing equipment, semiconductor, and solar PV industries for the past 25 years. Since 2006, Reza has played an active role in the solar PV industry globally. His recent posts have been board member of the Quercus Group, a leading European renewable energy fund, the VP of Strategic Projects at Leclanche, Europe's largest energy storage and battery manufacturer, and most recently, the CEO of the EV Network. Reza, over to you.
Thank you, Natasha. I'm delighted to be chairing these sessions with a distinguished panelist, including Katharina Winbeck, covering policy, Oliver Johnston, ABB, covering technology, and Paul, covering engineering and delivery of the infrastructure. It's been a very interesting morning listening to other speakers and panelists so far, and everybody is really, you can see, passionately contributing to this topic. Just a brief introduction before I ask my team to give their own personal introduction. In case you are not familiar with what we are doing at the Electric Vehicle Network, EVN, we are a pure play developer of charge infrastructure, high powered infrastructure, and we are asset holders for 20 odd years plus. We don't take power price risk, we don't take utilization risk. We are quite unique in our business model, and we have recently raised 50 million pounds in the first tranche and 150 million pounds in the second tranche of what we are developing and holding assets for fast public charging infrastructure. Before we go into each section, I must say that I am a late member of the EV club. I have been so far proper petrol head, and I have recently, in the past week or so, I've taken delivery of my first EV, and my first experience has been charging infrastructure. In my home, although I have 3 phases of electricity and 36 kilowatt peak of solar, nevertheless it's charging at 2.2 kilowatt and it's taking 35 hours to charge my EQC. And when I went to a public charger very recently, sadly, 2 of them didn't work, and the third one didn't work, and I had to call 2 telephone numbers in order to get through to somebody who can then restart the charger for me to charge my vehicle. That's just let's call it my first experience of trying to use my EV. But I'm sure as time goes by and we all get better at this, both infrastructure at home and in public charging will be improved, and we will get to the next sector. My other confession is I have still not got rid of my large ICE petrol and diesel vehicles, just as a backup. So I will give you my feedback on the EV in the next few weeks and months on my LinkedIn, perhaps. So, Katharina, I would like to start with you to ask you to make an introduction for this session.
Thank you very much, Reza. So yes, I'm Katharina Winbeck, and I work currently for London Councils, which is a membership organisation of all of the London boroughs in London. And we have been working very closely with the boroughs, with all of them, and the Mayor and Transport for London on supporting an electric vehicle rollout in London. It's been a stated aim, and we want London to be a sort of a global leader on EV and EV infrastructure in particular as well. So it's been a stated aim sort of since 2016-17, really, which is encouraging, and we have come a long way, I would suggest. So we have also within London Councils, within my team, sort of EV coordination function, which is a relatively recent addition to my team, and sort of is the point of call for coordinating the rollout of infrastructure, making sure that procurement systems are in place. We currently have got 2 procurement frameworks, for example, one for slow and fast chargers and one for rapid chargers, which have been very well received by both industry and local authorities alike, and have been really, really well utilized. But the coordination function is also now looking at, how do we engage more with the users, for example. So we're doing quite a lot about demand. What is the demand? How are our charging points that we're currently installing utilized? And how do we make sure that we put the charge points in the right locations so that they remain being utilized? And we just, in our pre-discussion, talked a little bit about stranded assets. And I think in London, that is a particular issue because curb space is just so little off, and so many different demands on it. So it's a real issue for London to get that right. So I lead the policy activity for London councils for transport and environment. So I see the EV sort of bit of it very much as contributing to the wider outcomes, such as our ambitions to become a net zero carbon city by 2030, and Reza, you alluded to that, but also to reduce air and noise pollution in London, which is close to very many Londoners' hearts, particularly around the air quality and the health effects that it has. So as many of you will probably be aware, most of the London boroughs have now declared a climate emergency, and all of them in some shape or form are working on a climate plan for the future. And most, like the mayor, have the target of 2030 to be net zero, and EV has got a good role to play in that. But wider than that, around transport, we also, of course, don't see EV as the answer for all of our journeys. We want to encourage more active travel. We want to encourage people to go back to public transport. And now, of course, alluding to the pandemic we're currently in, which has seen, a complete devastation of public transport usage. But on the positives, an increase on walking and cycling, particularly in the very first initial phases of quite strict lockdown. We've seen many more people, residents, taken to the streets by walking and cycling, and of course we now have got an opportunity to keep that going. The problem is with people not really having lots of confidence in the public transport system because of health reasons. We're seeing a higher car-based return, which of course is not our ambition, as we are looking for a green recovery out of COVID. So, and when I'm talking about the green recovery, EV has got a role to play, both in terms of getting skills and getting a sort of the green economy going, of which I see EV part of being. So there's a big supply chain that needs skills and needs people, and we need to train them up, and we need to make sure that we create jobs for that to happen. So yes, the market.
For sure, it's all happening in London. That's what we see when we look at throughout the country. It seems to be that there's a lot of activities going on in London, both on the private sector and obviously councils and the public sector. That is very clearly seen, and I'm delighted that listening to the Prime Minister yesterday and the Conservative Party virtual Conservative Party conference, the mention of green renewables, and I think he mentioned the word electric vehicle and EV infrastructure quite a few times in his speech. So it's lovely to see that the government is keeping at least that one promise that we are becoming a much more friendly towards green transport and renewables. Is still on the agenda.
Yes, it is. So which is very encouraging. And yes, so London at the moment has about 5,500 or slightly over charge points, which represents about 50% of the charge points across the country. And that sort of chimes with the EVs in London as well. We've got about 15% of all of the EVs in the country as well. So that roughly chimes. But in terms of the infrastructure, we're probably looking at the moment, we're probably oversupplying infrastructure, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because we're trying to encourage more residents to take, or for the essential journeys, to take up EVs. And we don't want residents to have the experience that you had, Reza, by getting to a charge point and then it's not working, or they don't know how to access it and that sort of stuff. So that's part of the coordination function I mentioned earlier. Is also what we're trying to get a more user-friendly experience, to get all the charge points onto a user-friendly map. And that is our vision, so that at some point in the not too distant future, people will be able to see where the charge points are, whether they're available, whether they're in working condition, and which operators they are from. So that's very much what we're trying to get to. And we've started some of that by, for example, maps are now getting more available, but they just show the location of the charge points, not whether it's available or functioning. But we are working with our partners on that. And that's also the good thing about having that framework, procurement framework, because we can set certain standards, and we want operators to enable us, to share the data with us, and also get to a point where we have, smart data and on the, data on demand going forward. So, but those are also the things that we are working on and looking to set up.
Perfect. Thank you, Katharina. Very comprehensive and very informative. Thank you. Oliver, you're next. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing at, obviously, ABB is a globally known and respected company in the energy sector and infrastructure. Tell us a little bit more about what you guys are doing in the UK.
Sure, Reza, thank you. Yeah, in the UK, we've been, or globally, ABB's been involved in the EV charging sector and the technology design of chargers and manufacturing of chargers for over 10 years, really right from the inception of the whole concept of charging public vehicles on CHAdeMO or CCS type connections. So it's definitely part of our DNA. And we're right at the forefront of that now, really, with high power charging in the UK, with most of the high power charging sites that are coming online in the UK, not exclusively ABB machines, but typically ABB machines that have then been white labeled by charge point operators to deliver those types of services. And I think obviously on the funding front, we've been very grateful to receive orders for that type of equipment as a company, because that obviously drives revenue into our business. But it's been the items are expensive, and so the people that are investing in that as future networks, or the public money that's coming into that's investing in future networks, are definitely enabling people to be able to uptake on EV charging and to be able to adopt an EV charger. And my story from yesterday morning was I had an EV delivered to me to try, because I need to take the transition now, which has now been enabled.
I saw that.
And the two gentlemen that turned up to deliver it turned up in identical EV cars. I'm not mentioning brands, but they turned up in identical brands as delivery team. And two sort of friendly chappies who are obviously doing this as part of their sort of pension pot or something, hopped out of the cars to then have a bit of a chat with me, and then explained they'd been sat for an hour on the local charger for about an hour and a half, making sure they delivered me an EV that was fully charged that I could then play with. And I think this is a critical sort of point where, if people don't know where these high power chargers are to enable their journeys in a simple way, it's just frustrating for people. So I pointed them in the direction which is north of me by about 8 miles, where there was a 150 kilowatt charger, which they could then fill this car up at speed. And they disappeared very happy. And they even text me later on to say, thank you very much. I saved them a sort of an hour or an hour and a half of their life, getting these two cars charged up to then take back home. And certainly for me, the deployment of high power charging in the UK, both on the M25 and on the M23 and the A34. Now there's a network which connects me to the north, because I'm fortunate enough to live down near Brighton way, but unfortunately that means I'm always driving north and I'm always looking for a charger somewhere to get me home. That really illustrates the ability that we can then switch over to those types of vehicles. And an ABB in the UK, and again, I'm a great believer in taking, I think we had a discussion previously to this conversation here, but I'm a great believer in taking hydrocarbon miles off the road. So it's all right looking at figures which detail how many EVs there are on the street, but really we're interested in how many EV miles are being driven and how many hydrocarbon vehicles are being taken off the street in terms of actual real miles. So that kind of data from OLEV or DVLLC or the OEMs to actually give us an angle of the trajectory. The trajectory is definitely happening. We're definitely heading towards the EV space, but the trajectory, the angle we need to go at to make sure the infrastructure is in place to match it or outstrip it is definitely a critical thing. I'm very I think there's an element of government funding that needs to play to make sure that we can keep pushing that trajectory and getting it really out there. And as I say, from my point of view, I'll be adopting an EV finally, but that has been realised by public, high power charging, and obviously the ability to charge at home. I'm fortunate enough to live in a house where I've got off-street parking.
I hear that ABB as a company in the UK and possibly even globally, perhaps, you guys are also changing your entire fleet.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that was my next point. Is the story of that is the company's adopted that policy, and we're taking over 500 ICE cars off the road over the next 3.5 years. And we'll probably take 30% of those off the road in the next 12 months because of the COVID backlog. We have lots of cars that are looking to swap out. So we're installing ABB home charger units in people's houses, and we're really taking that off. And if we look at the CO2 impact just on ABB UK and the businesses in the UK, it's roughly a 20% CO2 reduction just by swapping the fleet out. So some significant things we're doing. And I think everybody on these types of things, in these types of forums, etc., and these types of discussions, need to look hard back in their organisations and really take those steps, and that will keep pushing the ramp rate of where this goes, and then keep pushing the decisions from central government, etc., to actually enable some of the grid infrastructure pieces to come together to make it so the free market can deliver the EV charging, and then the interoperability of that and the usability of that is also very important, which has been discussed in previous conversations as well. So that was just a few steps in my problem.
That's great. Well, at least you've had a better experience on your delivery. My EV was delivered on the back of a very large diesel truck and offloaded from the back of a diesel truck into my drive. And to my disappointment, it had almost no charge on the battery. And on my 3-pin plug at home, it took, as I said, 35 hours to charge. So I could not even go for a test drive until 35 hours later. So you've had a better experience.
Yeah, and I was kind enough to drive. Left home about 6:15 this morning early. I drove up to the near high power station near me, and I charged my car. I stuck 120 miles in it in 20 minutes at 138 kilowatt hour speed, and I hadn't even finished my coffee before I had to drive home again. So yeah, so it does work, and it is a massive enabler for fleets to adopt, etc.
Excellent, excellent. Paul, you are next. Tell us a little bit about yourself, the company, and your intake into this.
Thanks, Reza. My name is Paul Barnfather, and I work for a company called EA Technology. My background is electricity infrastructure, so absolutely nothing to do with transport or cars. Until relatively recently, the electricity industry had nothing to do with transport, apart from possibly powering trains. Obviously, that's changing. And a few years ago, the industry started to look at what would happen if transport electrification was to become a thing, because it was still uncertain then. So way back in 2014, we started to explore the impact of EVs, domestic charging, a bit like what Reza's doing with his car. What would happen if people started to charge their cars at home? Because this was still an open question. So that was the My Electric Avenue project, and we bought 100 Nissan Leafs back then, which was a pretty big order for Nissan as well. There weren't many EVs back then. And that was where, in partnership with the electricity network owners, we started to see what impact these things might have and what that might mean for the upstream infrastructure. Since then, we've run the Electric Nation project for Western Power Distribution, which observed nearly 700 drivers charging their vehicles again at home, because that is one of the use cases. If you can charge your car at home, you probably will, because it's so convenient. So we expected that to be, again, a popular use case. And it's worth bearing in mind that, Reza, when your house was designed, or when your electricity supply was designed, nobody had any idea that you might be putting not just 2 kilowatts of load on, but 7 kilowatts of load on for several hours. So this wasn't a thing when the networks were designed. And now we're faced with building a network that enables this. And that's going to cost something. And the industry is at a bit of a crossroads here, because we understand now what the impact is going to be. We know what is necessary, what we need to do to absorb the electrification of transport. It can be done, and Graham Cooper's made that very clear. You know, the grid won't fall over. Clearly that was a concern many years ago. It isn't anymore. But now it's got serious, and we stand at a crossroads. We have, I think, enough data. We know most of the use cases, but not all. And we now need to start building the networks and extending the networks to cope. And we need to do this at a sensible cost. If we do it wrong, we will drive up electricity bills and make it difficult for people to charge and people to install charge points. If we do it right, your electricity bills will come down, not just go up, because done correctly, we can integrate EV charging with renewable energy supply. And suddenly, as the net zero targets have come into play, it all starts to make sense. Now, we need to build an electricity infrastructure that allows the deployment of charging infrastructure and the ongoing supply of green energy. We need to do that at scale, and we need to do that relatively quickly. And right now, we are still unsure as to exactly what the best way is to do that. So this brings us right up to date, really. I'm really interested in views as to how this is going to be financed, what the business case is, and what infrastructure we need to put out there to make sure that Katharina and Oliver can put his charge points out there. Katharina's residents are all able to plug in where they want. So that's the role. That's the challenge for the electricity industry, and that's take it from there.
Brilliant, thank you. You mentioned that my home is roughly about 500 years old, and I think when my home was designed, I don't think they envisaged that we will be having electric and autonomous cars coming in and out. But nevertheless, we are obviously the new future smart home should be designed with that in mind. Talking of which, there was a time that we were buying home based on perhaps mobile phone coverage. I know that we were going to buy a house, for example, we would look and see what the mobile network coverage is. Then it moved on to how good the internet is in your home that you're buying. And I know a lot of people were testing on let's say, sites where the speed of internet it's like in the new home they're considering to buy. I think next is we need to look at how good is your both internal electrical infrastructure to support EV charging, and also perhaps the vicinity of high-powered chargers. Funny enough, I live in a very small village in the middle of nowhere in Warwickshire, and I have to drive something like 45 miles to the next high-powered charger, which means by the time I get there and come back, I've used 90 miles of my 276 range mile in order to charge my car in a rapid or ultra rapid charger. So all of these are part of that future roadmap that we have to create and link up. But let me kickstart a couple of questions and observations that I would like to throw at you guys. And of course, the delegates, I would encourage you to ask questions, and I will go through those as they come through. Look, we are dealing with a very interesting situation at the moment where electrification of transport is happening, and it's happening globally. It's not just happening on the road, it's happening on sea, ferries, in railways, and not quite on air yet, but the airports have started to electrify their internal infrastructure. So for example, Frankfurt Airport is going to have all its entire vehicle running through inside the airport by 2025 will be electrified. So it's happening in all aspects of transport, and not just on EVs, buses, delivery trucks, taxis, etc. The question that I'm going to ask you guys, and I will start with Catherine in this regard, is what do we do to make, we're going to have to throw a lot of money at this. What do we do, how do we do this that it's most effective, little wastage, and most efficient in terms of delivering the best results? Do we invest in infrastructure, or do we subsidize in the tasks that we have in hand? And my personal view, by the way, as somebody who has been in various industries in the last 25 years, subsidies are designed to kickstart an industry and not to keep an industry on life support machine forever. Unfortunately, I went through the painful experience of the start of the solar industry in the UK, where some people were thinking that subsidies, government subsidies, should last forever. Of course, we saw that subsidies came to an end, maybe a little bit prematurely in some cases, but nevertheless, the industry started to really flourish and carried on. So do we invest in infrastructure in order to get that? And we heard this morning a lot about consumer confidence. Which comes as a priority, infrastructure or investment?
Well, I think it is both, Reza. I think at the moment we still need both. So the market is still quite small compared to other vehicles still. I mean, it is growing exponentially, but it's just not there. And I alluded to, we're doing some analysis of the usage data from the charge points that we're delivering, which is about 2,000 charge points and all residential. So all residential charge points, we have quite a good number of data now, and they are not being utilized at capacity. Definitely not. There might be a couple, but they're outliers that are being used quite a lot, but definitely not reached full capacity. So there is not a full business case for these charge points yet, and residents at the moment are not buying them quick enough to I guess to make that happen. And it is so at the moment, I would say we have quite a lot of charge points in London. We should have enough to satisfy all the users of electric vehicles at the moment. So there is something else why people are not investing in electric vehicles. And I suggest, price is a big determinant, and a lot of people just do not cannot afford an electric vehicle at this point in time. So we've got a very fortunate panel here that you can all afford electric vehicles, but that's just not the reality for many people out there. And it's certainly not something actually that the policymakers are encouraging. You know, we still want you to walk and cycle and use public transport before going to the use of a car. But if there are essential journeys, then please, yeah, we would want them to see in EVs.
Oliver, I'm going to ask you the same. What's your opinion on, as somebody and as a company, obviously you are heavily involved in this in this infrastructure build. What do you think is the most sensible way? And perhaps maybe you guys are obviously a global company. What experience can you share with us from Germany, Norway, Finland, and other countries in Europe who perhaps are having a similar sort of challenge in building the infrastructure?
Sure, Reza. I think there's been many, if you look at Norway and the Netherlands, for example, I think there's been a mass adoption of EV there because the subsidies have been quite attractive. So I think that's a positive thing. And then there's been various operators, the CPOs, which have also kind of grabbed the bull by the horns to you know, grow that infrastructure. You know, Norway's in a very fortunate position where they've got a cash bank as a country because it's that they're cash rich as a country. So I think they've been able to provide mass subsidies to cover a lot of their population of EVs. So a lot of those guys have been early. A lot of people talk about Norway, but again, it's a slightly skewed market because of the size of the subsidies that have been applied there, and where that money come from is also questionable to get them to that point, but they've got positive cash to put in this. But obviously, again, it's a balancing act, and I think again, Katharina's point on, you know, affordability for EVs and, you know, that second-hand market stroke, you know, the person that goes out and buys the $3,000 Ford Fiesta because that's what they need to do to get to their local job, which that's part of their life, that's what they have to do. The equality of that process and getting those vehicles off the road, I think, is a challenge, definitely. So I think those are the types of things, but there has been incentives for vans in London. There has been other incentives put in place to try and help that. But that is obviously a very serious issue, is how you get the affordability of this technology into the masses. And I again would go back to the question is how do you get the polluting miles off the road in terms of the 80-20 rule? If you can get rid of 80% of the traffic or 80% of the miles off the road with 20% of the effort, and that is the companies that can afford to do this transition, let's get the 80-20 rule done by companies that can afford to do it. And then where we've got that marginalization of people that maybe can't afford it, and we want to then finally tick that last 20%, it might cost us 80% of the funding to do that. But that's money well spent, I think. So I think we have to take the easy wins, and when the trajectory gets to the point where the government needs to intervene, maybe on the infrastructure or the DNO connections, and, you know, pull the electrical stuff upstream of our kit. We can in every type of thing we deploy, the biggest issue is definitely getting the electrical connection to our equipment. We can deliver the charging, yeah, all day, all night, no problem at all. But getting the electrical connection there is the biggest barrier to keep the trajectory going. But I think if we keep the trajectory going with the companies that can do this and get on with it, then I think that will make the decisions clearer for government and, you know, the DNOs, the Graham's guys in terms of his, you know, the national grid. I think those are all really important things. So I think this you know, the private sector can definitely deploy charging, and that retail experience that goes with it, I think that's an integral part of what that is. And I don't necessarily think that should be interfered with, but certainly getting electricity to the right places to enable that, to then enable the rest of the market is fundamental.
Yeah, that's it.
Totally agree. I mean, we are dealing with some at EV Network. We are dealing with some 1,600 sites at the moment for about 6-7 CPOs, and I think out of all the cycle of, let's say, from initiation, development, construction, and to handover, one of the biggest, most painful and time-taking challenge is to get electricity to the site. First of all, it's at the right price. We have an economic model which allows us, we've had grid budget estimates coming from, I don't know, £50,000 to £4 million.
Yep.
If you're going to upgrade a site and spend £4 million, it's not going to fit into the financial model that we have, developed for this. So you're absolutely correct in that regard. That's a very important part of this. And I'm hoping that obviously National Grid and everybody else are working on this, making this a seamless experience for companies like ourselves and yourselves in order to deliver the infrastructure. You mentioned Norway, by the way, very interestingly. They have no VAT on EV. They have no import tax on EV. They have no road tax. They allow EV drivers to use bus lane. There is, in certain part of Norway, there is no parking fee for EV drivers. You imagine that investments there. And there is also discount on ferry tickets for EV drivers. So you can see that the subsidy is coming in different way, shapes, and form, and not just £5,000 or now £3,000, £3,500 of the price of vehicle. Frankly, if the infrastructure is there and people are confident in buying an EV, cost of production will come down due to increasing production and demand, and in this case, it will become affordable and mass market. The other thing that you mentioned, very important, is there is no second-hand EV market as yet, to the point that the average person who can afford to spend, let's just call it below £10,000 of a vehicle, which today you have a very large choice of petrol and diesel vehicle. That doesn't exist at the moment. It's going to take some time to get to that. Possibly, I would say we need a cycle of probably about 10 years, by which time the life of the battery or the warranty on the battery has disappeared. So are we going to find a breed of second-hand buyer of EVs who will be confident on buying a 10-year-old or a 5-year-old EV with no warranty left on the battery? These are all question marks that we collectively as an industry and the automakers and the policymakers have to answer. Paul, what's your intake into infrastructure versus subsidies?
I mean, okay. I think Ollie touched on the really important aspect of this is whatever incentives we have, the key is mass adoption. Because as we've learned from solar and as we've learned from wind, no matter how much you subsidize it, it's not until it goes mainstream that the costs really collapse. When we were subsidizing offshore wind, it was up around the £100 a megawatt hour, and it kind of stuck there for a bit. And it wasn't until the market was designed to really encourage mass adoption, and this was a real stroke of genius in hindsight. Once it went mainstream, those prices collapsed, and we're now down to sort of £30, £35 a megawatt hour, which is less than gas. Incredible cost reductions from volume, purely from volume. We've seen that with solar, purely from volume. For the cars, and again, I touched on the cars briefly. Yes, the price point of cars is a real barrier at the moment. However, we're seeing Tesla and others starting to catch up who are using mass production techniques, and we're seeing the cost of batteries fall. That's going to continue. So the scope for cost reduction is massive compared to current EV prices. And in 10 years time, Reza, when the batteries, if the batteries are struggling to last beyond 10, 15 years time, a battery replacement in 10, 15 years time for that spec of battery pack, it's not going to be it's going to be a fraction of the cost of replacing an engine. These things get cheaper over time. So I think on the car side, I'm kind of confident that the costs will come down. On the infrastructure side, and as you're already experiencing, Ollie, At the moment, the connection is bespoke, the costing is bespoke. You're seeing crazy variation in prices depending on precisely where you put the charger. This has to change. And and Francis Warburton touched on it earlier, that Ofgem are hopefully going to move towards a much shallower connection cost model, where you just pay for the connection, so you're not hit with these random connection prices that seemingly for the end user. The connection is simplified. The connection is mass produced in the same way that the cars are mass produced, and the costs come down. At the moment, the infrastructure industry is doing every connection on a bespoke basis. Each time a charge point comes along, it's, oh, a charge point, that's interesting, that's unusual. We need it to become like we did in the 60s when the mass electrification happened, when housing estates were, there was a huge increase in electricity consumption. That was productionized, and we simplified it back in the 60s and rolled out electricity infrastructure at a phenomenal rate. The industry needs to learn how to do that again, because obviously we've forgotten, because that was in the 50s and 60s. And that way we can bring the cost down. Now then, I do want to, I'll note some interesting points in the chat window. The challenge with transport is it isn't one size fits all. There are different use cases. Your use case is not my use case, is not her use case, is not his use case. So we've seen this very clearly on our trials. People use cars in different and interesting ways. And what you can't do is build one size fits all infrastructure. You can't do it all motorway hubs. You can't do it all on home charging. Everybody is different. So what we need to do is look at the popular use cases, the ones to target first, and build the infrastructure for that. So we need to look at where are, this is a policy decision, it's not an engineering decision. What is the right way to start this decarbonisation? And back to your point, Ollie, about hydrocarbon miles displaced. I think some of the incentives at the moment are not necessarily displacing hydrocarbon miles at the rate they could do. So for example, company cars, which do phenomenal miles, workplace charging provision for vans and taxis. I think we need to start to look at not picking winners of technology, but picking the use cases that we want to go at first, because whichever one we pick, it's huge. There are a lot of vans, there are a lot of taxis. Whichever one we go for, this will lead to mass deployment. And some of them are no-brainers. I'll give you an example. I know the home charging one is not for everyone because not everyone has a drive. But for houses with a drive, the incremental cost of cabling, putting the cabling in so that you can fit a 7 kilowatt charge point is trivial. We should be doing that now. We're not. I don't know why. Because every house should be built with a 100 amp supply, ideally 3-phase 100 amp. We're not doing that. The marginal cost of doing that is minimal. So the legislation and the regulatory infrastructure, the things that we know to be true. So for example, I presume, Reza, the reason you're on a 2 kilowatt charger is because you're looking at several £100s to get a charge point installed, if not more. Now, I mean, this might horrify the home charge point manufacturers here, but realistically, when those things are mass produced, there's no reason why a home charge point shouldn't be more than £100 retail. The installation cost should be no more than 50 quid for an electrician to come and fit it. That's the price point you need to be aiming at. And I don't know what you've been quoted, Reza, but I can imagine with your house.
That's funny you say that. Look, funny enough, I contacted 5 companies and price ranged from sort of £350 to £10,500 for my home charger. Okay, so yeah. It's quite interesting because 4 out of the 5 companies were completely didn't know what they were doing. One company was spot on. They knew what they were doing. They followed it, absolutely every day. They had 2 guys and a lady on the call asking questions, asking me to load documents, and they're actually installing it next Monday. And I must say that they were fantastic in their approach and delivery. And 3 or 4 other companies that I contacted, one said, no, because you have 3-phase, we can't do it. Another one said, oh, because you've got, I don't know, something else, we can't do it. And it was just like, and one asked for, like I said, for £10,500 to put a 22 kilowatt DC charger in my home. So I thought, well, that's quite interesting. Look at the choice that I have available from £300 to £10,500. And it's very interesting. And you imagine an average consumer to face with this. I'm quite technology savvy. I am in the industry. I have network. I know who to call. If I get stuck, I call Oliver, and he gives me a hint and put me in the right direction. But if you imagine, if you have an average person who really is not in this, how difficult it is for that person to get this done properly.
And I'd like to chuck something out there, if I may, because in my mind right now, home charging should be solved. We know how to do this. I realize it's not the #1 use case, but we could fix that now. Motorway charging. I think we know that motorway charging is a necessity. Whether it's vans, cars, buses, whatever, we need motorway infrastructure that we don't have now. And I think those two we can move on. The others, like on-street charging, in your environment, Katharina, in a dense urban environment, I'm not sure that we know exactly how to do that just yet, whether it's hubs, whether it's on street. And so I think we need to learn a little more. But so I think each use case will go at different speeds, but we don't need to wait for all of these use cases to be resolved before we move. I think we need to start now with the stuff that we know. We've probably, we have a tendency to overthink these problems in the energy industry and make sure that we come up with the one solution that fixes everything. I don't believe that exists in transport. That's what I've learned. We need to find the certainties and go for them now, and we'll pick up the rest in due course.
Let me touch base on something, please, Katharina.
Yeah, I was just going to come in there because, of course, in London, the number of driveways that exist in London is quite low. So it's about 40%, I think, at the minute, but it is reducing because we are building many more apartment blocks than anything else in London these days. So it is, for us, it's also an equity question. We want everybody to be able to access charge points, so we have to have an amount of on street that is accessible to everybody. And as I mentioned before, we've set up this website where residents can actually go to request charge points in their area and the location that they want to request one in, and it takes you to the borough site, and then they take you through a couple of criteria. And it also now starts to check, is there already a charge point near where you are rather than putting in another one, those sorts of things. So we're getting more sophisticated at that, and we're certainly not responding to each request. So we have to have a number of requests before we're actually putting in a charge point. But most of our charge points that we're putting in London have been on demand. So there have been requests, and a number of requests made for a location around where we put the charge point in at the end. So I just wanted to clarify that.
It's very interesting, thank you. Let me move on to something else, which is perhaps, again, learning by the past experience. It should always give us sort of a path to the future. Public-private partnership in investment in building the future infrastructure. And I go back to what we as the UK and the government at the time did a fantastic job in setting up the Green Investment Bank. You may remember in the early days of 2010, 2011, when David Cameron became Prime Minister, one of the first things he did was the Green Growth and the Green Investment Bank, GIB, which was sadly sold in 2017 to another bank. But nevertheless, the role of coordinated investment in the renewables was a very good move at the time. And how do we go? The government is throwing a lot of money at this electrification of transport at the moment. And if you look at every day, you hear, yesterday Boris said 160 million, 5 billion here, 2 billion there. I know this magic money tree at the moment is growing faster and bigger and better every day. But realistically, in the COVID economy that we live in at the moment, how do we best go about putting some sort of a coordinated approach to making this investment? I mean, one project that I am working on at the moment is setting up the first green mobility fund. We haven't decided to call it whether green mobility fund or green mobility bank, but initiatives like that where we can attract money from both the sector, private sector, institutional investors, and also, I must say, inward investment is a very important part of our economic cycle to be able to attract foreign investment into the infrastructure, as we've done in other parts of the industries. So what do you think about how do we go best about making this private public platform for investment and encouraging this partnership to flourish as it did, as I said, in the early days of the renewables? Oliver, I'm going to start with you on that.
I wouldn't say I'm on a financial whiz, Reza, but I can understand those types of partnership programs, and I think if the use cases are there and the return on investment for the capital is fairly well defined, then I think it's an obvious vehicle to bring to the market. So if you've got large fleets, or you've got dedicated taxi fleets, or something which is a sort of a very realizable investment cycle and then a return on investment, then I think that obviously makes absolute sense to go down that route. And if you've got the same, if you've got the same situation with a particular charging location which can stand the test of a financial mechanism to go into that space, and the land is available to achieve that sort of long-term asset investment in the same, I know Paul's talked and you, Reza, have talked about 30, 40 years sort of investment cycles which should be going into this type of infrastructure. And I think those are very clear things that can be done absolutely as an investment vehicle. And I think some of those questions that drive those go or no goes is the land. And I think we touched on this conversation, all four of us before, is the availability of land for doing these infrastructure sites that will match up with last mile delivery, which can also be purposed for public transport bus charging, which can also be dual purpose for local residents charging. All those types of land spaces are becoming more and more difficult to get hold of. So I think those financial vehicles are great as long as there's a long-term asset that can sit behind it to enable those things.
Absolutely. I mean, look, we've got what, 35 million of vehicles in the UK apparently, and some 8,500 petrol stations across the country supporting these 35 million vehicles. Put that number in perspective. When people talk about we need, I don't know, 16 million chargers, do we have 16 million diesel and petrol pumps, for example, at the moment to support the 35 million vehicles on the road? It's interesting, depending on who you talk to. Obviously, you get 10 million answers. Katharina, what do you think about the idea of having a coordinated investment platform where all of these good work that everybody from National Grid to small companies are doing in the sector are best seen doing the work?
No, I think that's a useful step forward, and I think one good thing that government did do with its subsidy is it's requested match funding, and in London we're certainly seeing, to start with, most of the local authorities picked up that match funding, but more and more some of private, particularly the providers of the charge points, are now investing the match funding bit into these as well. So we're seeing some of that happening, but I think in terms of the whole sort of green recovery and green finance, we need a better mechanism, and we haven't quite sorted that yet. And it's certainly something that we are looking at to developing jointly with our partners, the mayor and TfL and so forth, and also private sector partners. But I don't think we're there yet, and we need to definitely develop it alongside. And I just noticed Natasha is coming, which means we're at the end of our session.
How long do we have, Natasha? You're muted.
Another minute to close out, if you could, please.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Well, Paul, you've got you've got 30 seconds
Okay,
to
I can do that. I can
and
do
then
that.
I've got 30
Right.
seconds to wrap up.
Yeah. No, two proposals really. I mentioned that it needs to be use case specific and mass adoption is the key here. First proposal, all new houses are mandated to have a charge point provision fitted. That will drive the mass market and mass rollout of charge points and drive the cost down for everybody, including you, Reza. So first of all, that's a legislation change. No finance needed. The marginal cost is trivial, is minimal. Make sure that new houses with a drive are fitted with a charge point. That's use case one. Second one, motorway service stations. Those service stations do not have infrastructure to the site that's adequate for our future needs. You need 5 to 10 megawatts at those sites. Build it. Now, to roll that infrastructure out, to put 5 to 10 megawatts capacity at each motorway service site will take capital, requires investment. It's low tech, it's dead certain. We can do that now. Once you've done that, you can auction off, sell, lease, whatever that capacity to the free market to put in whatever charge points people want to put in. That's really up to them. But whatever, we know that those sites need capacity. So let's do it now. And that needs finance. Doesn't need grants, doesn't need subsidies, it needs finance. Those would be my two suggestions. Those are the dead certs for now.
Thank you. And I think I wrap up by really saying this, what I call this transition, this creating this mobility ecosystem that we are arranging, we are developing, we are building in UK. We must take into account a number of factors, including air quality, UK manufacturing growth, high-skilled jobs, especially at the time that unfortunately every day we hear tens of thousands of jobs are lost due to various reasons, and especially COVID. UK climate commitment is a very important part of this decarbonisation of transport. And most important, of course, social inclusion, taking into account the happiness and the journey that we are taking the consumer with us and not leave them behind in this sector. This is really, really important. I want to say a big thank you to the panelists by contributing to this session, and for all our fantastic audience who listened and looked at us on this new virtual summit, which seems to be working, I must say. After 7 months, we've managed to master this. Natasha, I think our time is up.
Thank you, Reza. Thank you, Oliver, Paul, and Katharina. Really interesting discussion, because I think, as you all have correctly highlighted, there's no one solution, and you've got to look at all the different charging infrastructure required in its different segments and tailor a funding solution that works for that particular segment and use case. So I think I completely concur with that thought process. So thank you so much for that input. We will now pause the live stream for just a few seconds as we prepare for our next speaker panel. And please stay tuned, audience. We'll be back in a second.